We're privileged to be joined by a trio of high-profile New Zealanders, Right Honourable Sir John Key, a former National Prime Minister, these days Chair of Air New Zealand, among other business commitments, former Labour Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Helen Clark. These days I've described you, Helen, as a global public servant, which I think that expresses where you are, really, and Boao Forum, who we heard before. These speakers will discuss the strategy for New Zealand as we look toward reopening our borders as the global pandemic rollout progresses, pressures created by the tensions between US and China, and what it will take to get New Zealand business back onto an external growth path. If you please welcome our speakers. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Sir John Key. Sir John was really in on the ground of this particular summit and gave it his endorsement, and it's been a pleasure to see how it's grown over the years, and thank you for the commitment you showed, Sir John, during those early summits. Sir John's built a unique global business footprint since leaving politics. As I said before, he not only chairs New Zealand's largest bank, but he also advises companies like Comcast in the United States on their China business interests, as well as Kiwi companies like Zespri. Back in the day, Sir John led annual business missions to China. I think I went on 7 of the 8, or it might have been 8, or 6 of the 7. I can't quite remember how many, but they were very interesting to be on. I mean, the first one up was one where the 7 of our key leaders went shortly after in 2009, after the melamine disaster, which Helen Clark had to lead New Zealand through. So there's interesting times that they've seen. He's also met frequently with China's leadership, both in New Zealand, Beijing, and at Boao Forum in Hainan. So John, welcome to give your address now. Thank you.
Fran, thanks very much. Kia ora tātou, daja hao, and good morning. Can I actually just begin by acknowledging not only the dignitaries in the room, but actually everybody in the room, because there are so many familiar faces here, and you were a large part of making the New Zealand-China relationship a very successful one in my time as Prime Minister. So I thank you for all the things that you did in that regard. I want to acknowledge my panellists, obviously former Prime Minister Helen Clark. Helen and I are linked at the hip these days together trying to raise money to save the Kiwi. So if you have a few spare coins you don't know what to do with, you can feel free to give them to the Kiwi for Kiwis charity. And can I just acknowledge Boao Forum, who I was on the board of Air New Zealand when we selected Boao to take over from Christopher Luxon. Boao, I think, deserves an enormous shout out for being an outstanding CEO. He's probably got the hardest job in New Zealand, came from running Walmart in the United States, which has a turnover greater than New Zealand's GDP. So it's the toughest job in the country, Boao, and I think you're doing it with great aplomb, and it won't be too long before the airline will be back on its feet and flying us all around the world. I suppose to start, I mean, I took, I think it was 7 visits to China as Prime Minister. And when I came in actually in 2008, I had already established, a fairly strong view actually that China would emerge as a superpower, that it would be critically important to New Zealand's economic future, and that it was an important part of my administration's vision really and foreign affairs policy that we had a good relationship with China. And I thought in the sort of true Chinese sense, it could be a win-win situation. Great for China, who wanted to buy a lot of the products and services that New Zealand produces, but also great for New Zealand. And I think post the GFC, that proved to be absolutely correct. China was a very important part of making sure that New Zealand got through the GFC much more easily and far more rapidly and got back on its feet. I think by any objective measure, if you sat there today and looked at the global position on China, you would say that position has hardened, deteriorated, and worsened. And a large part of that has to be sheeted home actually to Donald Trump and the United States. And the reason for that is quite simple. Donald Trump wanted to measure his relationships with other countries via trade. There was a massive trade imbalance and remains with the US and China. He wanted to have a particular bogeyman he could hold up as things that were wrong and why his voters in the flyover states' life wasn't as good. And so his argument was, China didn't play fairly, and I'm going to change that and resolve the situation on your behalf. Now, actually never really did change things from a trading perspective. In fact, things actually got worse. But that rhetoric has taken hold globally, and that is the backdrop that you'll find probably, I suspect, although I don't read them anymore, Chris, in the foreign affairs briefings that are around the capitals of the world. So I just pose this question to you because it is a very different perspective to the one that I hold and continue to hold. Should New Zealand just follow that view blindly? So the basic argument about the hardening situation with China rests around a number of issues. South China Seas, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the Dalai Lama, Uyghurs. You've heard all those issues raised this morning. The panellists will be talking about them, I have no doubt, all day. Those things are not new. Those issues were around in my day. They'll continue to be around in the future. I would make the point that, yeah, of course, you know, there are situations where New Zealand would comment, but for a very long period of time, we have held a one China policy. We have respected China's rights in various territories and always recognised that. That's the long-standing and remains a New Zealand position. So do I think that we are entitled to have comments and have dialogue and discuss issues as we see them with the China administration? Absolutely. And in my day, we did that, as Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said in her remarks this morning. We make those comments publicly and privately. But just raise the point. Are we more likely to be successful if we do have concerns about something we see in any country of discussing that when we have a friendly relationship with them, or are we more likely to be successful if we ice that relationship out? And in my view, we're much more likely to be successful if we have a constructive working relationship where as friends we can raise any particular issues that we have. Second thing I think you have to ask yourself, is China likely to become more important to New Zealand going forward from being already our number one counterparty for goods and services, or less likely? And the simple bottom line is they're going to become more important. And the reason for that is their economy, while it is emerging as a superpower, while it is arguably maybe in nominal terms now the largest economy in the world, or if not, will be pretty soon, the bottom line is there's still 600 million people living in China with very low incomes, and they're urbanising, industrialising, getting wealthier, and they want to buy what New Zealand produces. We also are in a unique position with China. So under Helen's administration, the FTA was signed. Under my administration, it was extended to all parts of one China, something that's quite unique around the world. It's not a position we find ourselves, for instance, in with the United States, where we did try and get a free trade agreement under TPP, only to have Donald Trump actually rip that agreement up. So in my opinion, China is going to become more important actually to New Zealand, not less important in an economic sense in the years to come. So the argument that's always put forward is, should we have all our eggs in the Chinese basket? Well, the answer to that is no. That was the position I took when I was Prime Minister. Not because we don't like our friends in China, not because we don't think it's important. I always used to say to New Zealand exporters, I think that you should consider all the markets, and we were always constantly trying to find new and better access to other markets for that reason. Why? Not because it's not a good thing to have a strong trading relationship with China, but because we've been in that position where all our eggs were in one basket. That was in the United Kingdom, and they chose to go with the European Union into the EEC, and along with that and the oil crisis, it created the enormous problems that Rob Muldoon had to deal with and New Zealand had to go through as they had to find a new market. So the reason that we have a very strong trade focus across all of the 190 plus countries in the world is so that New Zealand can diversify. That's the sensible thing to do. I just want to give you a bit of a practical example about when we talk about win-win. I think there are ways of constructively working with China. So it's been noted by Fran, do a little bit of work for Zespri. I'm on their China Advisory Board. Some of you may know some of our rootstock or avatars were taken illegally to China. They're growing in China, and of course China's been a pretty good place to grow kiwi fruit. So just to give you a bit of perspective, in New Zealand there are roughly 8,400 hectares of what we would call G3, which is our gold kiwi fruit, growing in New Zealand at the moment. That rootstock was taken to China back in about 2015-16. There are now 5,400 hectares of it being illegally grown, in our view, in China. So you can see how rapidly that situation presents a real risk for Zespri, its brand and its product in market. There are lots of ways that the Zespri board could choose to deal with that situation, but the way it's choosing to adopt it is to see whether we can have actively, with the support of the growers, and we require that, so we're going through that vote at the moment, a situation where we could look to use to license some of those growers in China, ultimately licensing, we believe, quite a lot of growers in China, to have a situation where kiwi fruit could be grown to the same quality as we do in New Zealand, as we do already in Italy, on a basis where we could supply our product in market 365 days of the year. So in every situation, you will always have some conflicts, some issues of concern, some issues of dialogue. It doesn't mean it has to end badly. I think what it means is you have to look for creative ways to find a good solution. And I think Zespri is doing that. Finally, what I would say to you is probably where I sort of started and then leave the other panelists, and that is to say, look, you have to accept that the global position on China is changing. There's no point in sort of arguing anything else. I mean, I am one of the few sort of, advocates of China, and that when I go on these panels that you'll hear, not because I'm stupid or, in my opinion, misguided, but because I've had a long history of dealing with China, and when I've dealt with them, they have always, up front, been honest and honourable about what they've done, what they can agree to and what they can't. That's been my long-standing position. All I would say to New Zealand is that I think it's really important that whatever position we take, personally I hope it's for a good relationship with China, that we do it in a way which is deliberate. We do it in a way where we decide it, because that's what an independent foreign policy means. Because I think if you go and have a look at where New Zealand's going over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, it's going to continue to be what it has been over the last 10, 20, 30 years. We are an amazingly good place to grow things. We're a very beautiful country that people want to come and visit, and we've got extremely creative people that want to come up with fantastic products and services that they want to export to the world. China is going to be the largest economy in the world by some margin. It is going to be a very important influence in the world, and we are part of Asia. That does not mean that we will agree on every issue. It does not mean that we maybe share some of the historical links that we do with our traditional allies, like the United States or Australia. It does not mean that we have to have a poorer relationship with them. But it does mean, in my opinion, managed correctly, we can have the sort of relationship which is successful for both sides, where with respect we can discuss issues with both sides, and economically the fortunes of New Zealanders can improve because of that. Because whatever we think about the situation at the moment, I simply make this point. As we sit here today, there are literally tens of thousands of New Zealanders whose jobs, businesses and livelihoods rely on the fact that China is our number one trading partner. I, for one, would not throw that away simply because some people around the world are taking a slightly different perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir John. It's my pleasure to invite the Right Honourable Helen Clark to give her address. Helen, as Prime Minister back in the day, announced the negotiation of the groundbreaking free trade agreement with China, which was signed on her watch in early 2008. That required considerable interfacing with China, China's leadership, big negotiations to overcome the resistance of the agriculture ministry in China to New Zealand entering that particular domain, but it served us well, and it was a huge moment for New Zealand exporters who accompanied Helen Clark to Beijing for the signing of the FTA. Since leaving politics, she spent 8 years as head of the UN development program, and I think that pragmatism which characterised her prime ministership here also continued with key capitals. Now, as co-chair of the World Health Organization panel, which has been probing the global response to COVID-19, she has some incredible insights to share with us on how the vaccine rollout may or may not work for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran, John, Ambassador, Greg, ladies and gentlemen. I was reflecting that it's 9.5 months since we met in this room at the last summit, and a tremendous amount has happened since then regarding both the pandemic and the context of the China-New Zealand relationship. I'm going to touch on both of these interlinked themes today. But on the pandemic, let's cast our mind back to 20 July 2020 and our discussions here. Just 9.5 weeks before that, we'd come out of the 7-week nationwide lockdown. And in general, I think there was a pretty good feeling about the COVID-19 free outcome the country had achieved. Let's face it, we were probably all a bit smug. 2.5 weeks later on, reality hit as Auckland was plunged back into another level 3 lockdown, and that has happened twice more since. Nonetheless, for the most part, we live a more or less normal life in New Zealand, albeit without international visitors and students, and with a big hole in GDP and tax revenues. Much as the rest of the world would love to have our problems. But let's acknowledge that for business, it has had to pivot very rapidly to adapt to the new environment where it can, and obviously not everyone can, where the core business was international tourism and education. As Fran implied, I've spent a lot of the last 10 months as the co-chair of this independent panel on pandemic preparedness and response, which was mandated by the World Health Assembly in May last year. And we were asked to review the internationally coordinated response to COVID-19 and make recommendations for the future. We quickly defined our task as developing an understanding of how and why a disease outbreak became a pandemic and what could be done to prevent such a catastrophe happening again. We will release our report on the 12th of May, but the interim report put out in January has already set out the direction of our findings, that most countries were not prepared for a pandemic, that the disease surveillance and alert systems were too slow, that many countries took far too long to respond to the declaration of the public health emergency of international concern of 30 January, and that when they did respond, the response was both too late and inconsistent for the most part. The result has been a runaway pandemic, which is still accelerating, as is evident from even the most casual glance at the international news coverage, from India's agony to protests with coffins on Copacabana Beach in Rio de Janeiro. Yet it isn't rocket science to work out what would help build a better response in future. And our panel will make clear recommendations on that. The big question really is whether the world's member states can muster the political will to make the changes required at the national and global levels. Meanwhile, there's much that could be done to curb the pandemic. There are proven public health measures which over time New Zealand and a number of others, including China, have steadily put in place. Of course, test and trace systems, self-isolation and quarantine, and masking are at their core. And now there are the vaccine rollouts. Getting a high level of vaccination globally is critical. but it is insufficient as a standalone measure. The virus which causes COVID-19 is adapting continually, and we must continue to be on our guard against it and expect to be regularly revaccinated. The best we can hope for globally in the medium term is to be able to move from the pandemic phase to an endemic one. That is, the virus will be continuing to assert itself and we will have to manage around it. It would be helpful to have a clear strategy from the World Health Organization on what its end goal with COVID actually is. In my opinion, that goal should be the end of COVID-19 as a public health threat. That would require many more countries, and preferably all, to adopt a zero-tolerance approach to the disease, whereby you detect it, you stamp it out. Countries as diverse as New Zealand and China have shown that this is possible. Meanwhile, it's very urgent that there is more equitable access to vaccines and that the production of them is hugely scaled up. New Zealand is among the countries which has orders for many more vaccines than we could ever use ourselves. And so we've already committed to donate vaccines for 800,000 people, that's 1.6 million doses, and the priority for those will be the Pacific. Such redistribution of vaccine stocks is imperative at scale globally, as many low-income countries currently have very little access to vaccine supplies. As long as transmission of COVID-19 is out of control anywhere in the world, the more protracted the pandemic will be. No one is safe until everyone is safe. Let me come now to comment on the current context of the New Zealand-China relationship. New Zealand governments since 1972, almost 50 years, have without exception worked to build dialogue and relationships with China. That began with Norman Kirk's pledge to recognise the People's Republic and establish diplomatic relations with it, saying at the time words to the effect that it was simply nonsense not to recognise the government of a quarter of the world's population. The same principle surely applies today. Whatever the differences in political and value systems, and there are many, New Zealand must engage with China, both in its own interests and in the interests of encouraging global dialogue and interaction. We share one planet with many challenges, and it will take the widest possible range of countries working together to find solutions, whether that is to end the pandemic or to fight climate change. As the Prime Minister underlined this morning, New Zealand values its independent foreign policy. Our country isn't anybody's footstool. It is a small, Western, geographically isolated, democratic society with long-standing relationships which it values with others of similar disposition. And I have therefore been somewhat staggered at uninformed and highly slanted commentary aired in sections of the United Kingdom and Australian press to the effect that New Zealand is turning its back on its traditional partners to give preference to its relations with China. This is a slur and should be denounced as such. Both sets of relationships are important. The current brouhaha has arisen over developments in the Five Eyes relationship. When I was Prime Minister, its existence was actually never openly admitted. It was an under-the-radar intelligence sharing cooperative, and frankly, that is where it should have stayed. It is a huge leap to go from that to an expectation of coordination of policy positions across the 5 countries. That would amount to a significant infringement of New Zealand's sovereignty and therefore limitation on our independence. We have been living through a period of heightened geopolitical tension. not unlike a new Cold War where countries are pressured to take sides. I don't think this will change much from the Trump to the Biden administration, although one would hope now that more diplomatic tools would be deployed. New Zealand needs to have the self-confidence to stand its ground and not be pulled into the jousting and the jostling. Our relationships with our traditional friends are very important to us. Our relationship with China is a large and strategic and very valuable one, in which we must keep the space to air points of difference. We should avoid a unidimensional approach to all our relationships to enable us to engage where appropriate and to distance where appropriate. The many links between New Zealand and China which have developed, notwithstanding the obvious differences in political systems and values, suggest that both countries view engagement as important and of mutual benefit, and I hope that will long continue to be the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's now my pleasure to invite Greg Foran, Chief Executive of Air New Zealand, and a former China head for Walmart to speak with us. It's fair to say that Air New Zealand's finally turned a corner with the opening of the Trans-Tasman bubble with Australia, which, as my colleague Tim pointed out earlier today, has resulted in a number of speakers coming across the Tasman today. But Air New Zealand's fortunes were strongly affected when international aviation links became paralysed during COVID-19 crisis. But however, the airline has done a terrific job in supporting our exporters' links with China. As the global rollout of COVID vaccines continues, we do hope that the restoration of Air New Zealand's China business travel market will also come into scope. Please welcome Greg.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, John. Ambassador Wuxi. Zashang Morena, good morning. Well, what a year it's been, particularly in the airline business. And here we are 15 months into this, and just let me share with you a few things that I've learned through this. The first thing is I fail as a forecaster. This has been one of the most difficult situations to try and forecast that I have certainly ever been involved with. And, there are just so many things that continue to play out. Helen, as you've mentioned, what we're seeing is increasing COVID cases around the world. In fact, last week, and the numbers are always difficult, aren't they? We potentially had as many cases last week as what we had in the first 5 months of this pandemic. So just dwell on that for a second. Incredible, isn't it? And of course, it doesn't share itself equally. There are some industries that have probably had the best 15 months that they've had in a long time. In fact, as I was scanning some data over the weekend, the 6 largest companies in the S&P 500, collectively, when you look at their Q1 earnings, got $10 trillion in market cap, which represents 25% of the S&P 500. And here's another incredible statistic about those 6. Their top line revenue grew in the first quarter at 43%, which completely defies the law of large numbers. And so COVID's not spread itself equally around. In fact, many industries, particularly those that have been driven off the back of, if you like, e-commerce addicts, have probably had the best period they've ever had. But in travel and tourism, of course, it's a different story, and Air New Zealand fits into that. I can't say I've ever been in a business that's had its revenue fall by 99%, but that was quite an experience. We, of course, saw a dramatic change, and I reflected on it on the weekend when I was out around Auckland Airport, at just what it was like this time last year to see literally no one travelling. We, of course, had to let a third of our staff go, and passenger numbers actually plummeted significantly. But some good things have played out. We've done a good job with the support of the government at moving some cargo, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. We, of course, have been able to move 1,000 Kiwis home each week over this last year. And that's a big deal. Not every airline has maintained links to bring people home. And as already been mentioned, we're seeing some progress with getting the Tasman open. And as you'd expect, it's a little bit lumpy and bumpy at the moment because there's some concern about what will happen. Take Perth, for example. We've had it open, we've shut it. We've had it open, we've shut it. Now we're going to open it again, and that's all in the last week. And that leads to a really interesting muscle that can get built in an organisation during this period, and one that I'm incredibly proud of all our Air New Zealanders. The ability to move at speed and be flexible. And I think that puts any organisation in good stead as you think about where to from here. So I've got some optimism around what's going to happen with travel. I can see that the Tasman is likely to be good for us, as is actually people leaving areas like Auckland and going and living in the communities. And we're already seeing some, I guess, good growth in our regional network as people are prepared to commute to their places of work. And I think that's good for Air New Zealand because that actually is our core. And if you want to build on any strategy, the golden principle is go back to your core and how do you build on that? But how are we going to open this thing up some more? How are we going to get the world up and running? And it is complex, and I certainly don't have all the answers, and as I talk to other airline executives around the world, neither do they. There's no doubt that the vaccinations work, and we've already heard that from Helen. So I hope that as Kiwis we really get out there and all get vaccinated. There's no doubt that it is going to help solve some of this problem. We often hear comments around herd immunity, and that's an interesting topic. I think the number that most people talk to around that is you've got to get to about 65 to 70% of the population vaccinated. It's interesting because Israel, who have probably been the first cab out of the rank, because of their digitised health system, they were able to get access to the vaccine quickly on the basis they would share data. I think they're running at about 53% of the population with 2 doses. So if to get to herd immunity, we've got to get to 65 to 70, I think all of us in the room know how hard it is to get that last 10. So I don't know what this looks like longer term, but probably the narrative of we've got this all solved is probably going to change to we've got it under control and we have the ability to live with it. One of the things that I did last week, I've got family in Sydney, so I took the opportunity of shooting over to go and see them, which is pretty much the majority of people that are on our planes at the moment. Many people are just holding back to see what's going to happen. But I decided I would download the digital travel pass. This is something that IATA have been promoting. I'd stress here that I hope what we do is, as a world, can come up with a solution here which takes friction out of it for all of us in the room who do want to travel, and therefore, instead of having to come up with 100 different digital passports, it'd be helpful if we could come up with one. This happens to be the IATA one. I used it last weekend. I didn't need to because we've got a bubble with Australia. But if I was going, say, to the US, it was a matter of literally minutes to download this app, to get it set up. And you can see I was able to input my flights. I was able to then download my passport details. That was simply by laying my iPhone on top of my passport, which of course has a chip, so it loaded it in. I would stress that the information here is safe because it's stored on your phone, it's not stored in the cloud. So you could imagine a world where you've downloaded this app. Ideally, there's just one. We haven't got 1,000 flowers blooming and every single airline or country feels they have to do one. You've gone and got your COVID test, which I did, and I'm able to demonstrate as I go to the airport that I can travel. So I'm hoping that in time we're going to be able to chart a course through this that will allow all of us to travel to countries that just don't have a bubble, which by far and away will be the majority of countries that we're dealing with. And so to China, because I know for sure that many of you in this room want to get up there, and so do we. It's such an important partner, as we've already heard from John. And I'm reminded from my time there just how critical China is to us, and also how long-term the thinking needs to be. You know, this is a country that comes out in 2013 under President Xi Jinping with One Belt, One Road. Starts in 2013 with a view that it gets completed in 2049. A 36-year program. Wouldn't be too many of us in this room who could grasp the concept of driving a program that would go for 36 years. And that's how I think Air New Zealand should think about China, and I want us to. So we're just infants really in our relationship because we've only been there since 2006. But I want to make sure that Air New Zealand is back there. And when we do, I can imagine we're probably going to have to use something like a travel pass, and there'll be some interesting dialogue around how do we feel about the efficacy of the Sino vaccine? Is that going to stand the test of New Zealand accepting that so that people from China can travel here? Will they accept the Pfizer vaccine? Because for this to work, countries are going to have to come together and agree on how they're going to operate. And of course, cargo, so critical for us. 2,600 tonnes, or if you convert that into planes, it's about 86 of our planes, their bellies full of cargo, heading up there last year to China. And we only represent a portion of what gets air freighted there. We've started up a service to Guangzhou just recently. We want that to continue. And importantly, cargo allows us to maintain links so that in time, when we sort out how we can move between New Zealand and China, which may be using the IATA travel pass or something similar, then we're able to get going quickly. So in summary, really proud of what we've achieved. But there's so much more to play out. This is very complex, and as I mentioned, it hasn't spread itself fairly around the world, that's COVID, and more still for us to try and solve in terms of how we're going to travel between the countries. But China's critical to Air New Zealand, as it is to everyone in this room, and I endorse the comments that have been made about thinking long-term, building that relationship. Thank you for your support of Air New Zealand over the last year. I appreciate it greatly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. We've got a range of questions flooding in from the floor, none of which I can see at the moment, by the way, so it'd be great to have that back. But before we get to that, I'd just like to talk a little bit more about something that was brought up by Ambassador Wu Shi about dangers of decoupling, just basically pressures against globalisation through great power challenges. And I wondered whether you had a comment, each of you, on how we should be thinking about that debate in New Zealand. Maybe starting with you, John.
Sorry, one more time?
No, just saying that Ambassador Wu Shi talked about the pressures on globalisation and the decoupling debate, and I wondered if you could give us your view on it all.
Yeah, I mean, you can see all those pressures with various different things taking place, particularly as countries have chosen to think about sanctions for a variety of different reasons, what impact that's had on the global supply chain. I mean, I think a disastrous outcome would be one where countries ultimately bring everything home so they're not so reliant on a global supply chain. That's a real challenge for all of us. And I think that's really at the heart of all of this debate. I think that will come through because ultimately the issue for all of us is, can we live in a world where we can have areas where we wish to debate, sometimes disagree, but do so in a way where we can still actually have a combined trading relationship. And the reason we want that is, one, we have areas of specialisation in New Zealand that we can provide value added that the rest of the world can't. And so that's a good thing. Secondly, for our consumers, actually, they get a much better deal. We often think about it from an export point of view, but actually from an import point of view, when we are part of a global trading system, our consumers, get a lot better access to goods that they otherwise would miss out on. And the final point, I think, is that there's been a long-standing sort of adage that countries that trade together don't go to war with each other. And I think, there is a very strong feeling that if you have a reason to talk to people, you are much more likely ultimately to resolve things. And you look at families where, I don't know, one of the parents stops talking to one of the siblings. Yep, it's an outcome, but it's not an outcome that actually ever generally resolves what the underlying issue ever was. And I think we've just got to make sure, that we keep all of those open. But it is definitely currently having quite a big impact if you think about the semiconductor industry and various others.
Yeah, I'd just like to stay on that theme. You mentioned the word war. Helen Clark in Australia, Peter Dutton, the Defence Minister, has in fact opened up, basically suggesting this might be an outcome for the region with China. How do you view that kind of rhetoric?
I think it's very disturbing, actually. Can I do it? I think it's very disturbing rhetoric. One has no idea how such a, quote, war would play out, and I'm sure he doesn't either. So let's hope that his boss pulls him back from that. But obviously there are a lot of pressures against globalisation at the moment, a lot of retrenchment, a lot of nationalism expressed in everything from vaccine to the extent of import substitution. And as I said, in many ways I don't think the change from the Trump to the Biden administration is necessarily going to change a lot about the way the US views China in the importing, exporting sense. But I think also for New Zealand, what we have to be conscious of is as well the way that the climate crisis debate is going to play out, with implications for our trade and exports in goods and services, with a growing resistance in high value markets, particularly in Europe, to people travelling long haul and importing food long haul. And those are some of the issues we need to have pretty smart strategies for. Otherwise, we're in the gun for being a carbon footprint heavy exporter. So there are some red flags on the horizon for us.
Greg, the political refrain from the leadership in the United States has been fairly targeted in recent years. From your links with business there, how do you believe business feels about it?
Oh, the United States is such a large, diverse country. The reality is that there are slightly different views depending on what industry you're in and even where you're located. Broadly speaking, many of the businesses that tend to be on the coast are probably reasonably happy with some of the changes, and those that are probably more geographically located in the middle, where some of their customers tend to be more Republican, are probably less so. But, the reality is when you look at the voting, it actually was pretty split, 50-50. There wasn't an enormous, amount of change. I was living in the United States when Trump was elected and watched all the tariff debates play out, and worked for Walmart, and you could imagine we saw things like a bike, and Walmart happens to sell more bikes than anyone else in the world. This is a United States business. And that price of a bike went from $39 up to like $79. So an enormous impact for a heck of a lot of our core customers that relied on Walmart being able to deliver good quality at low prices. So, you know, it was interesting watching that play out. Hard to tell exactly where some of that all ends up. In my time in China, I've also seen things change, and you know, there is no doubt that Xi Jinping, who is now many years into his role as the president, is becoming more vocal about what he wants in China. So you get slight degrees of change, whether it's in China or the United States, and it can feel like there are some pretty significant shifts, and the reality is, should it play out the way some pundits are talking about, then it could be quite significant.
Any comments?
Oh, look, I think, you know, one of the interesting things in the United States now, for whatever reasons, party politics has become a lot more partisan and divided, you know, and it's always been a rough and tumble business there, but I think, you know, there's virtually nothing that the Republicans and Democrats agree with each other on anymore, except their unified view that all things in China are wrong. And that's actually a problem. And I think, you know, to the point you were making about the bikes, Greg, I mean, The Economist wrote an article a while ago and said that if Trump put on all of the tariffs he was proposing, it would have the single biggest, most material impact on middle-income consumers in America of anything that's ever happened. So as I said, you know, trade's a two-way thing. I mean, we always think about it as access for our exporters into foreign markets, but it's also about New Zealanders, and in this case Americans, consumers' ability to buy a cheaper product. Now, you might say, well, we don't always want that, but not everyone in America can afford a bike at $79. Lots of kids go without it. At $39, they can afford it. So, I mean, that's the advantage of global trade. And you know, I think... my point is just simply around the politics of all this, is that you just do have to consider, at least, which bits of the debate are correct and which of them are there for different reasons. You know, I mean, it's like on climate change. I mean, I may be proved to be wrong, but I recall being at a number of functions with Xi Jinping as president, saying they were utterly committed to being part of the solution for climate change, and I genuinely believe that. They're a very large emitter. The planet will be disastrously affected if climate change isn't dealt with, and therefore it'll have a massive impact on their economy and their country. And I think you can see them demonstrating that they are doing things in the space, and they're also very rapidly creating intellectual property. So I think it's sort of, I think you just need to measure these things carefully and just think it through. I just don't get caught in the herd mentality, as seems to be the case a little in the United States at the moment.
Just a question on the vaccine before we actually take some very interesting questions from the floor, some of which will be embarrassing to some of you. But anyway, just that's a teaser. But just thinking about the rollout of the actual vaccine. You know, you both, or several of you, talked about there's not really going to be an end to the pandemic. It's going to become more endemic, and we're going to have to learn to live with a certain amount of infection. I mean, how do you sell that story to people who are quite fearful now and actually enjoy our bubble? And how do you kind of create a pathway for perhaps a business corridor for us to connect with, you know, better recognition and so forth? The passports Greg talked about, with countries that we want to trade with. And a lot of people in this room want to do exactly that. Maybe, Helen, you could kick off on that one.
Well, I don't think there'd be any public appetite here for living with a level of it here. People want it kept out. But of course, we know that inevitably when people are coming and going, and more will come and go, that, you know, there's always the opportunity for slippage, and particularly as more arrangements open up. So it seems to me that, you know, vaccine passports, digital passports, all of this is absolutely inevitable. We will probably end up with sort of tiers of travel relationships. There'll be the bubble countries. Australia is obviously the first. Let's see what is said about the Cook Islands today. I see Hong Kong and Singapore have opened up a bubble. That's starting to point to where the possibilities can be. I feel that probably the travelling Kiwi, for visitor purposes, put aside business for the moment, is going to be looking at a possible destination with an eye on whether they have the pandemic under control there or not, how big the vaccine rollout is, how good the health system is, and that we probably will want to stay pretty much in a comfort zone for the foreseeable future. I think if New Zealand can be reasonably fully vaccinated, and I'm mindful that Tony Fauci, the very eminent American leading the response there, says it could require up to 85% of a population being vaccinated. Think about it. The significant resistance to vaccine here will be a major problem. Because if you have 30% unvaccinated and slippage comes over the border and our guard is down, that'll collapse our hospitals. So we really do have to work on encouraging everybody to take that vaccine. But if we're fully vaccinated, I think the issue for then the New Zealand traveller, business or personal, is going to be what greets us when we come home. Are we ad infinitum going to face a 2-week quarantine? And I think probably the government will want to think in terms of some kind of traffic light system where you'll have the bubble countries where there isn't a quarantine. You may have arrangements, say, for, let's call them green zone countries, which have got a good level of vaccination and pandemic under control, where you might require self-administered tests and isolation at home for 3 days. But I think for people coming from red zone countries where the pandemic's out of control, expect the 2-week quarantine to be around for a long time. That would be my guess. And we're not close at the moment to that traffic light system either, because, and let's reinforce it again, the pandemic is accelerating. It's not going away. It is accelerating. Sobering, Greg, to think that last week we got as many infections as in the last 5 months. India was running at a rate of 1.2 million infections every 3 days. So we're not at the end of this horror yet, and we just have to work to manage our way through it as intelligently as possible.
I think that's exactly right. I think there will be a point in time when people start to see enough data and enough information that encourages a shift in the narrative. At the moment, there is no doubt that for the majority of people that I talk to, it's elimination, and that's what we've got to do. But as we've just been sharing, that's going to be a very difficult situation to deal with, and you end up, I suspect, at a point in time where we learn to manage what we've got and work our way through that. I agree with you. I don't see this happening immediately, but I do see progressively through this year, towards the end of it, and next year that we get an opportunity to open up to more countries, albeit it will still be a bit clunky. Now, what it looks like the year after, 2023, is going to be interesting. And as I began with my speech, I have failed abysmally in terms of forecasting what's going to happen, so I wouldn't hold a lot of stead in that at this stage.
Isn't the story, Fran? I mean, we've got to basically say, look, the vaccine is the solution. It may not be perfect. It may not cover you from everything. You may need a booster. But in the absence of anything else we know, the vaccine is the best thing that we can do, and getting the world globally vaccinated is the right thing. Secondly, one thing that really worries me in New Zealand is the number of people I run into who tell me they're not going to take the vaccine. That's crazy in my view. I mean, firstly, unless I'm missing something, I don't think you'll actually easily be able to travel unless you have the vaccine. Secondly, you are putting other people at risk, particularly some people who maybe can't take the vaccine for specific health reasons. Thirdly, I don't think you actually have anything to fear. I mean, you know, we vaccinate our population for things like measles, mumps and rubella anyway, so it's an important thing that we do. And, you know, so I think we've got to get that message out there that people have to be vaccinated. Secondly, I think it would be lunacy if we get to continue a situation where we're going to MIQ every person who comes back from overseas forever. I mean, that is a joke. I mean, we've got to get to a point where we learn to live with the vaccine and live with the virus, should I say, and deal with it in a way that's sensible. I mean, there's modern technology. I mean, today, if you go to an airport in Germany, they will rapid test you before you get on the plane. They'll test you when you come back. There's no arguments that we can't get to a point where there's a more nuanced system that says, you know, if you come from the United States, and let's argue we don't deem that to be a red zone country, that you can go home and maybe you're quarantined for 2 days and you do a rapid test. I mean, my daughter just went back to the UK and they did exactly that. They said if you want to take the rapid test, you have to self-isolate at home for 10 days, but if you want to pay and take the rapid test and you don't come from a country that's a red zone country, then you can do that. You can leave much more quickly. So we have to have some dexterity about what we're doing. Otherwise, we're going to have sort of enormous sort of problems. And the last thing I think is we just got to realise what's actually really happening. I mean, the reason the economy is going okay is because, to Greg's point, some companies are in the sweet spot and they're able to benefit from that. But we have interest rates at the lowest level they've basically been in the history of New Zealand. We've got the Reserve Bank printing money and we've got the government running massive deficits through huge economic stimulus. There is a point at which you've got to pay the piper. One day you have to pay that money back. So, you know, ultimately we have to earn our way in the world, not spend our way in the world. So the government has to find ways of this country interacting with the rest of the world. And it can't be that we sit there in isolation forever, because I don't know about you, but I looked at the funeral of Prince Philip recently and I thought, what a terribly sad situation. The Queen's sitting there, you know, on her own, essentially with a very small group. Well, that's a situation replicated by thousands of families around the world, and in some instances not even able to have a funeral. When we live in a global world, a third of people that live in Auckland weren't born in New Zealand. So they have family all around the world. We can't forever say, you can't travel, it's not going to work.
Thank you. And now to these questions. I won't read them all out, but Sir John, do you believe New Zealand and the United States would have handled things differently if you and Obama were still in power?
Well, yeah, yes, but look, I mean, you know, the simple reality is that as I said earlier, you know, I think the left and the right of politics in the United States, Obama's obviously a Democrat, you know, Trump was a Republican, have a unified view that they are expressing very significant concerns with China, ones that I don't share, but they come from a different perspective. But President Obama would have chosen his words more carefully and at least tried to leave the door open to a more mutually respectful relationship. So that's what would have been different. No one is arguing with all of this stuff that you can't have a genuine conversation about issues that you have concerns. It's the way you do it. And it's like a household. You know, you don't always have to have a full noise row with someone to make a point. You can actually talk to your kids at a normal level of decibels and make the same point probably more effectively. You know, it's the same argument.
Well said. Greg, a question here asking you to draw on your experience with Walmart and touch on some effective ways to manage business relationships with Chinese counterparties.
Sure. The first comment I make is I actually found it very helpful whenever I met with officials and even local Chinese business to be able to show that I actually was a New Zealander. Mm-hmm. And generally the narrative changed because obviously they expected me to be American and to pull out my American passport. So that immediately, I think, gave me an opportunity. There are some things that are actually pretty similar that I learnt that play out over there just like they do in any relationship, and one of them is obviously that whole trust and honesty, and I can reflect on many situations where, for example, I would find out that we were selling counterfeit products in Walmart, and we shouldn't be selling counterfeit products, so there's no point in blaming anyone else, and no point in me blaming the supplier who sold it to me. It was up to me to put in place the right checks and balances to make sure that we were doing the checks and we weren't doing it. So this whole, being prepared to tell the truth, being honest, building that relationship over time stood me in a reasonable position. Mm-hmm. But then I also went to the trouble of learning the language as best I could and reading as much about the history as I could to try and understand what are some of the differences and why do people do things the way they do. And when I did that, I began to actually understand things a little bit differently. I can remember early on going into work in Shenzhen. Many of you in this room will have been there. Very busy city. It's changed a lot over the last 30 years. And people would be driving on a 6-lane motorway down the wrong way. And you would go, well, that's just completely ridiculous, until you understand that some of these people have been living here for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and for them it was simply a road. And it didn't matter whether you went on the left or on the right, it was simply a road. And you needed to accept that. Now, for sure, it was dangerous and all the other things, but there was no point in pulling your hair out and getting angry about it. You had to appreciate other people's perspectives. So, that's what comes to mind.
And another question, which is here, Greg Forum, is Prime Minister next for you, considering you're sitting...
Absolutely not.
Okay. Yeah, well, the rest of it was considering...
Oh, come on, Greg, you'd love it, eh?
Honestly, John, no interest. Absolutely none. I have my hands full.
I guess to be fair, you've got your own plane. You don't need the 757.
We've got a spare one. We can lend the government.
That's a good point. Anyway, a question here from Jade Gray to the panel. Australia's been used as an example to the rest of the world of the risks of speaking out against China. What insight does New Zealand take from this? Maybe starting with you, Helen?
Well, I think it's an example of departing from diplomacy, actually. Australia, like New Zealand, has its views on issues, which include human rights. But what we always strive to do, I think, across governments was create the kind of relationship where you could deal with those issues while you also dealt with the range of other interests that you had, which are often shared. And in a way, it reminds me of the position we eventually extracted ourselves from with the American relationship. Because you recall, there was a time, well, I certainly recall it, whenever a New Zealander official or minister or prime minister engaged with the United States, the very first issue that came up was that they didn't like the nuclear-free policy. Well, they still don't. But eventually, after I'd been in government for 6 years, we had approaches that said, maybe there's different ways of dealing with this. And the metaphor we came up with was, yes, it's a significant and ongoing difference of opinion, but every time you get the car out of the road to travel in the direction of a dialogue with the United States, that doesn't need to be the road bump that you run into first, right? Let's talk about the things we have in common, and we'll come in eventually to the roadblock. I take the same view with China. We have a lot of things to discuss with China, a lot of things to engage on. We need to be able to raise the other issues, but we don't need that to be the road bump that stops us ever talking about anything else. And that's why I say, let's just get back to diplomacy and how we handle relationships in a sophisticated way.
Yeah, I think Australia's always actually been a bit more, robust, I suppose you could say, in its criticism. I think it's because it's an active member of ANZUS. It's always felt the need to follow the US line a little more closely. I mean, look, in the end, I make the same point when I'm in Australia that I just made today, which is that Australia has lots of reasons why it wants a good relationship with China, and China has lots of reasons why it wants a good relationship with Australia. It's mutually beneficial to both sides, and putting some respect back into the dialogue on both sides would be useful for both counterparties.
Okay. It's a nice question. Which business or political trip to China do you all remember the most, and why? Maybe we could start with you, Greg.
Oh, look, I have a raft of stories, and I'm not going to get into them because they would land me in all kinds of trouble. But suffice to say that, having lived there effectively for 3 years and run a business, a large American business, and had to interact with all kinds of people, there was barely a day that went by, certainly a week didn't go by, where I wasn't dealing with a number of issues. And I would often have to speak to the masters back in Bentonville and try and explain to them the differences of dealing there. It was not uncommon, generally on about a weekly basis, for example, that a customer would happen to, unfortunately, pass away in one of our stores. And, it's not when you think about how many people live there, effectively 1.4 billion, you've got hundreds of stores, they're in all kinds of places around China. What would happen when that occurred is that the family would come and sit at the front of the checkouts and block all the checkouts from operating. And the only way that we could deal with this was actually to write a check out to the family, which generally ended up being about 600,000 renminbi, to give to the family to deal with the family member that had passed away. And I can remember the first time this occurred and trying to understand, what do you do in this circumstance? Do I ring up, the police and try and do something? And of course, that wasn't going to get me anywhere. Do I talk to the government officials? That wasn't going to get me anywhere. We're a large American company, seemed to be very successful. Write the check out, get on with it. And after a while, you just build a muscle in your business, much as I spoke about in Air New Zealand, becoming quite flexible and fluid over this last year, dealing with lockdowns and opening up and breaches and quarantine. You had to do that in China. And the reality is the leadership group that I had in China was probably equal in terms of talent to what I had in the US, yet the business in the US was 30 times larger. And so if I was going back into China and running a business there, I would be picking my very best talent, and I would be ensuring that they were with me for a long period of time, like 7 to 10 years, as opposed to you're up there for a year or 2 years, I'm an expat and I'm out of there. Go back to the whole scenario of 36 years to put in place a strategy. So I have lots and lots of stories, but getting those relationships right, building a strong team, and being able to deal with circumstances that you have never ever dealt with before on literally a daily and weekly basis puts you in good stead.
Well, when I began going to China as the UNDP administrator, I engaged with it in a different way. And I remember that first visit in 2009. I had a very clear impression of a conversation I had with Premier Wen at that time. And he said to me, it's important to remember that even now, that was 2009, China's GDP per capita was not in the top 100 in the world. So the framing was very much that still human development was such a huge priority for China. It's only just now, I think 2020, that China has been able to say it has eradicated extreme poverty. I recall on that visit, 2009 or 10, whatever, going to a UNDP Global Environment Facility project in a village, maybe an hour or so out of Beijing. and you go from the sophistication of Beijing to a village that you could see, anywhere in Myanmar or a poor part of elsewhere in Asia. And the project there was about how to bring sustainable energy to heat underneath the concrete slabs on which people's mattresses were in their simple homes in this village. And it was a real reality check that China has been on a long, slow path, accelerated since Deng Xiaoping's reforms, to lift its people out of poverty. So that really resonated with me, and I think when we think about China and its positioning in the world, China needs peace for its development. It needs peace for its development. And we, as a supplier of goods and services, of course, are a part of that story as well. And I think it's important to see it in that light.
Sir John?
I had a lot of great trips where I went there, both as PM before it and subsequent to that. And I mean, the thing is always the vibrancy of the place. Whether you're in Guangzhou or Beijing or Shanghai or other parts of it, and the food's fantastic and things are done amazingly well. So everything's pretty good. But if I'm really honest, the thing I remember one of the things I remember very clearly was the very first trip I went when I was Prime Minister. I had been a few times as a business person, so I kind of knew a bit what it was like. And I said to the MFAT people, look, can we go and get there on a Sunday, because I'm going to take the kids. And China really likes family, so they were really happy that the kids were coming with us. And I said, look, can we just have the Sunday and we can go and do a couple of things and it'll kick off Sunday night. And they said, yep, that's fine. So I said to Max and Steffi, who were really young at the time, I said, look, we're going to go to Tiananmen Square in the morning, the Forbidden City at lunchtime, and the Great Wall of China in the afternoon. So they said, oh yeah, that's all great. So we're going along in the car from the hotel, and I said to Max, who was really young at the time, I said, mate, stay really close to me. And he goes, why's that, Dad? And I said, because it's packed down there at Tiananmen Square. It's amazing, and I don't want to lose you. And he goes, oh yeah, okay. We get there. The car's pulled into the middle of Tiananmen Square. There's not a single person on the whole thing. And Max gets out and goes, hey, Dad, what are you talking about? There's no one here. We must be pretty early. I said, no, mate, they've cleared it. That's the Chinese way of doing things. It's quite cool, eh? And it's like Tiananmen, the Great Wall of China was the same. We have the most amazing photos, like literally in 10 kilometres. There was no one on it except for us. So, yeah, it's a great way to travel. It really is. So I go back to my point, Greg. You should become Prime Minister, and then you can have these amazing snapshots, So it's pretty good.
I think that is the perfect place to end the session. Thank you so much for your recollections, and more particularly for your insights into the situation that we face today, not just globally, but importantly with New Zealand and China. Another round of applause, please. Thank you. Thank you.